The best emo is all about connection. We see something of ourselves in the artists, in the music, in their vision. This is definitely true for The Used and for My Chemical Romance, two of the emo scene's heavyweights. These guys have built their careers on giving us something to relate to, something to call our own. So when we see the vocalists of these two bands, Bert McCracken of The Used and Gerard Way of My Chemical Romance, entering into a beautiful friendship, it's heartwarming. It's like we've made a friend ourselves. And when that friendship goes sour, when two guys who were once best buddies fall out, it hurts. We feel their pain. So what exactly happened here? How did these two go from being emo scene brothers to feuding enemies? Let's find out as we explore the rise of one of emo's most beautiful friendships, and the messy fallout when the whole thing fell apart. It's hard to imagine a time when The Used and My Chemical Romance weren't already emo royalty. But trust me, back in the early 2000s, this really was the case. My Chemical Romance formed in New Jersey in 2001, after the trauma of the 9/11 terrorist attacks drove Gerard Way to seek a new creative outlet for his fears and anxieties. Across the country in Utah, The Used had already formed the previous year, but they were still seen underdogs, searching for their big break. It was The Used that broke through first. Their self-titled debut album was released on the Warner imprint Reprise in June 2002, and went platinum thanks to catchy, raw-edged tracks like The Taste of Ink. MCR would release their own debut only a month later, but on the independent label Eyeball Records. I Brought You My Bullets, You Brought Me Your Love is now considered a stone-cold classic of the genre, but relatively few people got to hear the record back in 2002. 4 people who certainly did hear the record were the dudes in The Used, and they loved it. MCR found themselves performing as the support act on The Used's next tour. This brought two of emo's most iconic frontmen together for the first time. Bert McCracken of The Used, with his chaotic, high-energy style, and Gerard Way of My Chem, with his own gothic screamo majesty. A little like Freddie Mercury fronting Thrice. As some might say, game recognized game. The two burgeoning superstars became close friends almost immediately. Perhaps they saw something of themselves in each other. The Used and MCR are two very different bands, but both channel pain, fear, dread, and anger into electrifying music. And both frontmen had similar problems too. Each was struggling with mental health and addiction, and each was experiencing how the fire and fury of fame could make both of these demons way, way worse. Perhaps Bert and Gerard knew that they were on an exciting, terrifying journey, and the best way to survive this journey would be to find friends they could rely on. But how long would this friendship last? Was it doomed from the start? The emo landscape of 2003 was much the same as it had been in 2002. The Used were still way up there at the top of the pile, with legions of adoring fans now spanning the globe. And MCR, well, they were a little behind, but just a little. They were still the scene underdogs, but it was clear their next move was going to be something very special indeed. By 2004, both bands were on the same label, Reprise, and both had a new album on the way. It was The Used that struck first, releasing In Love and Death that August, featuring the raucous Take It Away. As expected, it was a huge hit, cementing The Used not only as emo icons, but as bona fide mainstream icons too. But when MCR released 3 Cheers for Sweet Revenge the following month, it was clear the dynamic had shifted. The Used Take It Away is a stunning track, but it doesn't capture the early 2000s emo zeitgeist like I'm Not Okay does. Gerard Way called the album's lead single a self-help pop song. And for thousands of emo teens, this is exactly what it was. Take It Away was angry and bitter, in a good way. But I'm Not Okay offered emo kids something different. It held up a mirror to their own lives. It showed them that someone out there understood their pain. My Chemical Romance were no longer the underdogs. They were the scene leaders. The Used, while still megastars, couldn't quite match this kind of love. That didn't matter though. Bert and the Used were overjoyed for their buddies in MCR, and the friendship was stronger than ever. This friendship is really exemplified by Bert and Gerard's famous duet on Under Pressure. The song made famous by Queen and David Bowie was originally a live show exclusive for fans to enjoy. But it ended up featuring as a bonus track on the reissue of In Love and Death, and it was even released as a charity single for the victims of the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. The Used and MCR version of the track shows the genuine love and brotherhood between the two singers. It's two artists at the absolute top of their game, demonstrating their fondness and respect for one another. But maybe it shows us something else too. Just like Freddie Mercury and David Bowie struggled with the pressure of fame and the crippling power of addiction, Gerard Way and Bert McCracken were experiencing the same thing. By this point, Gerard Way was drinking heavily and abusing both cocaine and prescription drugs. Bert McCracken had had problems with crystal meth and heroin in the past, and was lapsing back into serious drug and alcohol misuse. Perhaps the choice of song Under Pressure was apt. The two vocalists were very much under pressure, and they were feeling the strain. But were the two best friends helping each other navigate the difficulties of fame and addiction? Or was each just acting as an enabler for the other's self-destructive habits? It wasn't long before Gerard Way and his MCR bandmates knew that something had to change. While MCR was becoming one of the biggest bands on the planet, Way was drinking to alarming levels. Coupled with drug abuse, this was creating a lethal cocktail of substances that was pushing Way into dangerous territory. When it all got too much, the singer's thoughts began to turn towards some serious, dark places. Gerard Way was beginning to consider suicide, and his out-of-control lifestyle was putting him at increasing risk of acting on those thoughts. Fortunately, he confided in his bandmates. Their action was sharp and swift. Go to rehab, get clean, keep yourself alive. Incredibly, after 4 years under the influence of almost anything he could get his hands on, Gerard Way completely sobered up in just 17 days. For Bert McCracken, the journey wasn't so easy. While recording In Love and Death, the Used singer's pregnant girlfriend had died of a drug overdose. Understandably, this shattered the frontman, who was already in a fragile and dangerous position. Suddenly, the two friends who had been on the same journey together were spiraling off in radically different directions. Way was embracing sobriety and newfound freedom from addiction, and his band were a tight unit at the height of their artistic and commercial powers, working on what was going to be their biggest album to date, The Black Parade. McCracken, on the other hand, was turning to drugs like never before. The death of his former partner and unborn child weighed heavily on his mind, and there seemed to be no other way to deal with it. And as for the Used as a band, things were not quite so harmonious. The band announced that Brandon Steinekert had left the Used, only for the former drummer to claim he'd been kicked out. Without a platform of stability from his group, the future looked uncertain for Bert McCracken. Perhaps this is where the seeds of the feud were first sown. The two close friends had walked similar paths and experienced the highs and lows in the same way. But now, one was moving in a new direction, while the other was left feeling abandoned, maybe even betrayed, and more alone than ever. Neither Gerard nor Bert would go public about the feud until later on, so we can't be sure exactly when the two stopped being friends. What we can be sure of is that their intense friendship burned out at some point after both bands had released their second album, a time when the Used and MCR were really hitting their creative strides. So what would happen next? Could Gerard and Bert reconcile and rekindle their lost brotherhood? Or was their friendship over for good? At first, fans didn't notice there'd been a falling out. They were too wrapped up in the great music the guys were making. But then Bert broke his silence, although he didn't offer much clarity. "I'd prefer not to say anything about My Chemical Romance," Bert told MTV. "Except that we did have a falling out. We don't speak at all anymore." McCracken didn't go into too much detail, but he was quick to downplay any rumors that he was simply jealous of MCR's success. "It's got nothing to do with their success. I'm completely comfortable with where our band is at. We used to be very close, but no more." He also suggested that the other members of the Used had remained tight with MCR. All of MCR, Gerard Way included. "The rest of my band, they're still mates with all the guys in that band, but I'd prefer to say nothing more about My Chemical Romance." What was going on here exactly? Bert wouldn't be drawn on this question, and he stuck to his word. He didn't say anything more about Gerard Way and MCR. At least, not in interviews. In his music, on the other hand, he had plenty to say. It's pretty clear that Hospital, on the Used album Lies for the Liars, is aimed at Gerard Way. There's just too many references to 3 cheers and I'm Not Ok's for it not to be. "Will you look them in the face?" Bert sings. "Could you look me in the face? 3 cheers, you fooled them all." And Pretty Handsome Awkward, off the same album, is even more savage. "Your market value, your resurrection, your shallow concept." It's been speculated that these lines are about Gerard Way. There are plenty of other references to My Chem in this track too, but Bert is in a particularly brutal form when he follows this up with the lyric, "Help yourself, I hope you choke and you die." Things were getting pretty nasty. So how are Gerard Way and My Chemical Romance going to respond? As it turned out, Gerard Way and My Chemical Romance didn't have much to say about the whole thing at all. There was no room for diss tracks on the 2007 album The Black Parade. If Way was going to put the boot to his former friend on this record, it would have to be extremely subtle, as this one is a concept record about a dying man and his journey into the afterlife. In the end, either the disses were too subtle for us to even notice, or he just didn't bother. And there was no room to square personal grievances on the next record either. Danger Days, The True Lives of the Fabulous Killjoys, was another sprawling concept, set in a post-apocalyptic Los Angeles. If you were looking for digs at Bert McCracken on this record, you might be out of luck. So was this Gerard Way rising above the noise of the feud? Did he feel the whole thing was beneath him? Possibly, but he might have just been pissed off. Some of the stories to emerge from the feud are pretty silly and juvenile. Things like Bert McCracken allegedly interrupting MCR's set on the Warped Tour back in 2005 with a megaphone. It's possible that Way was simply annoyed by his old friend. And when Bert began to hint at a feud, Gerard just decided he'd had enough. So Way poured his heart and soul into music. And we can be glad that he did. Those mid-career MCR albums are not quite the emo classics the first two records are, but they're fantastic rock and roll albums. Meanwhile, Bert had been working hard on the Used and on himself. He got sober in 2012, leaving his own agony and addiction behind. But what about the friendship? Was there really no way back? From the formations of the Used and My Chem to the start of the feud was about 5 or 6 years. From then to now is more like 18 or 19 years. The Bert McCracken-Gerard Way feud has actually lasted longer than the Bert McCracken-Gerard Way friendship did. Actually though, most of that feud has been pretty quiet. Bert didn't say much else after popping off with a couple of diss tracks. Gerard didn't say anything at all. And both artists went on making music with their respective bands, barring a couple hiatuses here and there. Bert has since expressed regret over the feud. It's easy to see why. It probably seemed important for Bert to air his grievances and express his anger publicly back in 2006. Now he probably wonders why he bothered. Seeing Bert and Gerard together back in those early years, it's a pity that the relationship became so fractured. To an extent, this is life. It happens. But also rock stardom and fame makes navigating friendship even more difficult. There's just so much pressure involved. Gerard Way never responded to Bert's stated regrets. For him, the whole thing is probably just too long ago now, and barely even worth talking about. Will we ever see Way and McCracken back together as best friends, or at least as friends? Will we ever hear a duet like Under Pressure again? Who knows? But if we will, don't expect it anytime soon. Thanks for joining me on this one. This feud has become part of the lore and mythology of emo, and it's been great, if a little sad, to explore it. As always, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell me what I should cover next in the comments below. And there's another emo and pop-punk deep dive coming right up.